Hello and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wajenberg. This time we will continue our reading of Christmas at Fairacre, Village Christmas, by Miss Reed. Ever since then, thought Mary, busily prodding her hook in the rug, she and Margaret had fought a polite but quietly desperate battle against invasion. Be friendly to all but familiar with few, said an old Victorian sampler hanging on their cottage wall. The sisters found its advice timely. The children, they agreed, were adorable, and although they appeared far too often for a shilling for the electricity meter or a box of matches because the shop's shut and other like errands, the two sisters had not the heart to be annoyed with them. In any case, it was simple to dismiss them with when their business was done with a piece of chocolate to sweeten their departure. Mrs. Emery, growing weekly more bulky, was more difficult to manage, and the two sisters grew apt at making excuses. Once inside, she was apt to stay over an hour, seriously throwing out the working of the sisters' day. She certainly was an embarrassment as a neighbor. Mary's eyes strayed to the table and the rejected Christmas card with the gay robin among his spangles. A thought struck her, and she put down her hook. "Margaret," she said suddenly, "what about sending that robin to the Emery children?" Margaret began to look doubtful. "Well, my dear, you know what a mite of trouble we've had with that woman. I just wonder—" "Oh, do now," pressed Mary, her face flushed. "'Tis Christmas. No time for hard thoughts, sister, and them children would just love it. I could slip over with it after dark on Christmas Eve and pop it through the letterbox." Mary's face relaxed into a smile. "We'll do it, Mary, that we will." She began to roll up the rug briskly as the church clock struck 10. Mary gave a happy sigh and lifted the singing kettle from the trivet. "Time for bed," she said, taking 2 hot water bottles from the bottom of the dresser cupboard. "Think of it, Margaret, only 3 more days until Christmas." The next 3 days were busy ones for the ladies at Flint Cottage. Red-berried holly, pale mistletoe, and glossy ivy were collected and used to decorate the living room. 2 red candles stood one at each end of the mantelpiece, and a holly garland hung from the brass knocker of the front door. The cake was iced, the pudding fetched down from the top shelf in the pantry, the mincemeat jar stood ready for the pies, and a trifle was made. One of Mrs. Pringle's chickens arrived ready for the table, and sausage meat came from the butcher. Margaret crept away privately while Mary was bringing in logs from the woodshed, and wrapped up 2 pairs of sensible lisle stockings that she had bought in Caxley for her sister's present. Mary took advantage of Margaret's absence at the post office and swiftly wrapped up a pair of stout leather gloves and hid them in the second drawer of the bedroom chest. All Fairacre was a bustle. Margaret and Mary helped to set up the Christmas crib in the chancel of St. Patrick's Church. The figures of Joseph, Mary, and the child, the shepherds and the wise men, reappeared every year, standing in the straw provided by Mr. Roberts the farmer, and lit with somber beauty by discreetly placed electric lights. The children came in on their way from school to see this perennial scene, and never tired of looking. The sisters helped to decorate the church, too. There were Christmas roses on the altar, their pearly beauty set off by sprigs of dark yew amid the gleaming silverware. On Christmas Eve, the carol singers set out on their annual pilgrimage round the village. Mr. Annett, the choir master, was in charge of the church choir and any other willing chorister who volunteered to join the party. This year, the newcomer Mr. Emery was among them, for word had soon got round that he sang well, and Mr. Annett had invited him to join the carol singers. Clad in the duffel coat which Mr. Willett thought so poorly of, he strode cheerfully along the frosty lanes of Fairacre, swinging a hurricane lamp as though he had lived in the village all his life, and rattling away to his companions with the same friendly foreign loquacity as his wife's. One of their stopping places was outside the Beetle and Wedge, strategically placed in the village street. Mary and Margaret opened their window and watched the singers at their work. Their breath rose in silver clouds in the light of the lanterns. The white music sheets fluttered in the icy wind which spoke of future snow to the weather-wise of Fairacre. Some of the lamps were hung on tall, stout ash sticks, and these swayed above the ruffled hair of the men and the hooded heads of the women. Mr. Annett conducted vigorously, and the singing was controlled as well as robust. As the country voices caroled the eternal story of joyous birth, Mary felt that she had never been so happy. Across the road she could see the upstairs light in the bedroom of the Emery children, and against the glowing pane were silhouetted two dark heads. How excited they must be, thought Mary. The stockings would be hanging limply over the bed rail, just as her own and Margaret's used to hang so many years ago. There was nothing to touch the exquisite anticipation of Christmas Eve. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King, fluted the choir boys, their eyes on Mr. Annett, their mouths like dark O's in the lamplight. And the sound of their singing rose like incense to the thousands of stars above. On Christmas morning, Margaret and Mary were up early and went to 8 o'clock service. A feeling of night still hung about the quiet village, although the sun was staining the eastern sky and giving promise of a fine day ahead. The lighted crib glowed in the shadowy chancel like the Star of Bethlehem itself, and the aromatic smell of the evergreens added to the spirit of Christmas. Later, the bells would ring out, and the winter sunshine would touch the flowers and silver on the altar with brightness. All would be glory and rejoicing. But there was something particularly lovely and holy about these quiet early morning devotions, and the two sisters preferred to attend then, knowing that the rest of the morning would be taken up with the cheerful ritual of Christmas Day cooking. They unwrapped their few parcels after breakfast, exclaiming with genuine pleasure at the modest calendars and handkerchiefs, the unaccustomed luxury of richly perfumed soap or chocolates which friends and relatives had sent. Margaret thanked Mary warmly for the gloves. Mary was equally delighted with her stockings. They exchanged rare kisses and told each other how lucky they were. "There's not many," said Margaret, "as can say they live as contented as we do here, and under our own roof, thank God, and nothing owing to any man." We've a lot to be thankful for," agreed Mary, folding up the brightest wrappings neatly. "Best of all each other, and next best our health and strength, sister." "Now I'm off to stuff the bird," announced Margaret, rising with energy. "I'll put on the pudding, too, while I'm in the kitchen. Must have that properly hotted up by midday." She bustled off, and Mary began to make up the fire and sweep the hearth. The two red candles looked brave and gay, standing like sentinels each side of the Christmas cards ranged along the mantelpiece. She wondered if the Emery children had liked the fat robin. She could see them now, in imagination, surrounded by new Christmas presents, flushed and excited at the joy of receiving and of giving. At that moment, a rapping came at the front door, and she rose from her sweeping to open it. Vanessa stood there, looking far from flushed and excited. The child's eyes were large with alarm, her face pale with cold and fright. "What is it, my love? Come in quickly," cried Mary. "It's Mummy," she said. "Could you come over, please? She's ill." "Is Daddy with her?" asked Margaret, appearing in the doorway with her fingers pink and sticky with sausage meat. "No, he's had to go to Grandma's. Grandpa rang up last night after we'd gone to bed. Grandma's being stroked." "Had a stroke," corrected Margaret automatically. "Dear me, that's bad news. We'll be over as soon as we put the dinner in." The child's eyes grew more enormous than ever. She looked imploringly at Mary. "But it's the baby coming. You must come this minute. Please, please." Without a word, Margaret began to take off her kitchen apron. "Go over, Mary," she said quietly. "I'll follow you." Indescribable chaos greeted Mary's eyes when she stepped into the Emery's kitchen. It was a large square room with a brick floor and comfortably warmed by an Essa cooker appallingly streaked with grime. Quantities of anthracite dust were plentifully sprinkled on the floor at its base and had been liberally trodden about the room. The debris of breakfast littered the table, and colored paper, tags, and strings garnished... The debris of breakfast littered the table, and colored paper, tags, and string garnished sticky cereal bowls and mugs. A ginger cat lipped up some milk which dripped from an overturned jug, and confusion was made more acute by Francesca, who stood proudly holding a new scarlet scooter, ringing the shiny bell without cessation. "Give over, do," begged Mary, peremptory in her flurry. The child obeyed, still beaming. Nothing could quench her Christmas bliss, and Mary was immediately glad to see that this was so. The sound of Anna Louise's wailing became apparent, and Mary opened the door of the box staircase and began to mount. The two little girls started to follow her. "You stop here, there's dears," said Mary, much agitated, who knew what terrors might be aloft. "Pick up the paper and make it nice and tidy." To her relief, they fell upon the muddle joyously, and she creaked her way above. Mrs. Emery's voice greeted her. She sounded as boisterous as ever, and Mary's fears grew less. At least she was conscious. "You are a darling, you really are," cried Mrs. Emery. She was standing by the window, a vast figure in a red satin dressing gown embroidered on the back with a fierce dragon. Mary suddenly realized how very young she looked, and her heart went out to her. "We were so sorry to hear about your mother-in-law," began Mary, a little primly. "Poor sweet," said Mrs. Emery. "It would have to happen now. Edgar went off as soon as he came back from carol singing. And then this. Much too early. I suppose I've got the dates wrong again. Ah, well." She sighed and suddenly clutched the front of her dressing gown again. Mary felt panic rising. "Do get into bed, there's a love," she begged, turning back the rumpled bedclothes invitingly. The bottom sheet had a tear in it 6 inches long, and a very dirty rag doll with the stuffing coming out. Mary was appalled. She must put something clean on the bed. She supposed the baby was born in that unhygienic spot. She looked for help toward Mrs. Emery, who was bowed before the chest of drawers and gasping in an alarming way. "You must have clean sheets," announced Mary, with an authoritative ring in her voice which wholly surprised her. "Cupboard," gasped Mrs. Emery, nodding toward the next room. An unpleasant smell was the first thing that Mary noticed about the adjoining bedroom. Anna Louise was standing in a cot. Her nightgown and the bedding were ominously stained, but her cries had ceased, and she threw Mary a ravishing smile. "You pretty thing," cried Mary, quite entranced. "Aunt Mary'll see you in just a minute." She swiftly ransacked the cupboard. She found a roll of mackintosh sheeting and 2 clean linen ones. Bustling back to the bedroom, she set about making the bed with vigorous speed. Mrs. Emery was upright again, leaning her damp forehead against the cool window pane. She consented to be led to the bed, unprotesting, and let Mary remove the flamboyant dressing gown. "There, there," soothed Mary, tucking her in as though she were a child. "I'll bring you a drink." "I'm all right now," whispered the girl, and at that moment Margaret appeared. "Does nurse know?" was her first remark. Mary felt suddenly guilty. Of course, it was the first thing she should have found out. Trust Margaret to know exactly what to do. "Yes," replied Mrs. Emery. "At least someone at her house does. Nurse was out on another baby case. They were sending word." "What about Dr. Martin?" continued Margaret. "Nurse will get him if need be," said the girl. She sank back on the pillow and suddenly looked deathly tired. "It won't come for hours," she told them. "It's just that I was worried about the children." I know," said Margaret gently. "We'll look after them all right. Leave it all to us." "Anna Louise needs a wash," said Mary, retiring to the next room. She beckoned Margaret to follow her and closed the door between the 2 rooms. "What on earth shall we do?" she implored Margaret. Margaret, for once, looked flummoxed. "Dear knows, and that's the honest truth," admitted her sister. "Let's hope nature knows best, and nurse comes pretty smartly. This is foreign stuff to us, Mary, but we must hold the fort till help comes." She turned to survey Anna Louise, who was jumping rhythmically up and down in the cot with dire results. "Land's sake, Mary, that child wants dumping in the bath, and the bedding, too." "I'll do her," said Mary swiftly, "and then I can keep an eye on Mrs. Emery up here. You see to things downstairs." "Won't do no harm to give nurse another ring," observed Margaret, turning to the door. She looked back at her sister. "Who'd have thought we'd been spending Christmas like this?" She vanished downstairs, and Mary went to turn on the bath for her charge. Anna Louise, well soaped, was absolutely adorable. Fat and pink, with a skin like satin, she made Mary a willing slave. She patted the water vigorously, sending up showers of spray and drenching Mary kneeling beside the bath. Mary could have stayed there all day, murmuring endearments and writing the celluloid duck time and time again. But the water cooled rapidly, and there was much to do. She gathered the naked child into a grubby bath towel and dried her on her lap. "She hasn't had her breakfast yet," Mrs. Mary said drowsily when the child was dressed. She looked at her daughter with amusement. "That's Francesca's jumper," she observed, "but no matter. Tie a bib on the poor lamb. She's a filthy feeder." Below stairs, all was amazingly quiet. The table had been cleared, and the two little girls were blissfully engaged in filling in their new Christmas drawing books with glossy, long crayons as yet unbroken. Margaret was busy sweeping the floor with a broom from which most of the bristles had long vanished. "Has the baby come yet?" asked Vanessa, without looking up from the mad oscillation of her crayoning. "Not yet," replied Mary, threading Anna Louisa's fat legs through her high chair. She stood back and surveyed the baby anxiously. "And what does Anna Louise like for breakfast?" Francesca put down her crayon and gazed earnestly at her younger sister. "She likes bacon rinds best," she told Mary. "Well, we've no time to cook bacon," said Margaret flatly, still wielding the broom. "Egg," said Vanessa briefly. "All horrible and runny. That's what she likes." The sisters exchanged questioning glances. "Sounds reasonable," muttered Margaret, "if you can find the egg saucepan." "It's the milk one as well," volunteered Vanessa, making for a cupboard. "Here you are." She produced a battered saucepan with a wobbly handle and returned to the drawing book. "Did you get through to Nurse?" asked Mary agitatedly as she filled the saucepan. "Still out. Message supposed to have been passed on. I reckon we ought to get her husband back. It's his business, after all." Mary spoke with some asperity. "I'll go and ask Mrs. Emery," said Mary, "while the egg boils." She returned to the bedroom to find Mrs. Emery humped under the bedclothes with her head in the pillow. She was groaning with such awful intensity that Mary's first impulse was to fly for Margaret, but she controlled it. She patted the humped back consolingly and waited for the spasm to pass. Somewhere, far away it seemed, the bells of St. Patrick's began to peal for morning service. A vivid picture of the peaceful nave, the holly and the Christmas roses, the fragrance of the cypress and yew, came clearly to Mary, standing helplessly there watching her neighbor in labor. How long ago it seemed since she and Margaret knelt in the church, yet only 3 hours had gone by. Spasm passed, and Diana Emery's face appeared again. "Better," she said. "Can I have that drink now? Coffee, please. No, milk. Any sign of that confounded Nurse?" "She's on her way," said Mary, "and we thought we ought to phone your husband." "His parents aren't on the telephone," said Mrs. Emery. "We could ring the police," suggested Mary with sudden inspiration. Mrs. Emery laughed with such unaffected gaiety that Mary could hardly believe that she had so recently been in such pain. "It's not that serious. Nurse will be along any minute now, and think how wonderful it will be to present Edgar with a fine new baby." She sounded so matter-of-fact and cheerful that Mary gazed at her open-mouthed. Was childbearing really undertaken so lightly? She remembered Margaret's tart comments on people who had large families with such apparent fecklessness. How many more would there be in this casual household, Mary wondered. Then she remembered the sight of Anna Louise in the bath and hoped suddenly and irrationally that there would be more, lots more, and that she would be able to enjoy them. "I'll get your coffee, my love," she said warmly, and went below. Returning with the steaming black brew, she remembered something. "Shouldn't we put the baby's things ready for Nurse?" she asked. "There's not a great deal," confessed the girl, warming her hands round the cup. "I intended to do most of the shopping after Christmas in Caxley. So many people about, I just couldn't face it." "But you must have some things," persisted Mary, aghast. "In the bottom drawer," said the girl vaguely, "and there are lots of Anna Louise's things that will do in the airing cupboard." Mary was shocked at such a slapdash approach to an important event, and her face must have shown it, for Mrs. Emery laughed. "After the first you don't bother quite so much," she confessed. "You can get by with all the odds and ends the others had." Mary found 6 new nappies in the drawer, and a bundle of small vests, some tiny nightgowns, yellow with much washing, and a shawl or two in the airing cupboard. "And what shall we put the baby in?" she inquired. "Anna Louise's carry cot. It's in her room. It probably wants clean things in it." The girl had slipped down into the bed again and closed her eyes. She looked desperately tired, thought Mary, with a pang. The carry cot held 2 dolls, a headless teddy bear, and a shoe, all carefully tucked up in a checked tablecloth. Mary took it downstairs to wash it out and dry it, ready for the new occupant. "If that dratted Nurse don't come soon," said Margaret, "I'll fetch Dr. Martin myself, that I will. I'll just slip over home, Mary, and turn that bird and add a mite of hot water to the pudding." "We'll never have a chance to eat dinner, sisters," cried Mary, "not as things are." "There's them three to think of," replied Margaret, nodding to the children. We've got them to feed, don't forget." She lifted the latch and hurried across to their cottage. One or two parishioners in their Sunday best were making their way to church. Mary saw Mr. and Mrs. Willett stop to speak to her sister as she stood with one hand on the doorknob. There was much head shaking, and Mrs. Willett looked across at the Emery's house with some alarm. "The news will soon be round Fairacre," thought Mary as she dried the carry-cot. It was clean and peaceful now in the kitchen, and she noticed the paper chains festooned against the ceiling and the Christmas cards pinned along the rafters. Her own fat robin was there, and she glowed with pleasure. Vanessa and Francesca were still engrossed in their artistic efforts, and Anna Louise wiped her eggy plate with her fingers and sucked them happily. What dear good children they were, thought Mary. At that moment she heard their mother calling from overhead. Her voice sounded shrill and desperate. Mary took the stairs at a run. The girl was sitting up in bed, clenching and unclenching her hands on the coverlet. "You must get that nurse, or the doctor, or someone. I can't stick this now. It's coming pretty fast." "I'll ring again," promised Mary, thoroughly frightened by the urgency of the girl's pleas. "Just lie down again. I'm sure it's better. Can I do anything? Rub your back, say, or bring you a hot water bottle?" She did her best to appear calm, but inwardly terror gripped her. Supposing the baby came this minute? What on earth did you do with a newborn baby? Wasn't there something about cutting a cord? And if so, where did you cut it? And how did you tie it up afterwards? Hadn't she once heard that mothers bled to death if the cord wasn't tied properly? And that wretched carry-cot wouldn't be anywhere near aired, let alone made up with clean bedding, if the baby arrived now. Mary found herself shaking with panic and praying desperately. "Don't let it come yet. Please, dear Lord, not until the nurse arrives. Please, God." "There, my love," she began, when she stopped abruptly. The door of the staircase had opened, and someone was mounting. "Margaret!" she cried. "Quickly, Margaret!" A sturdy figure appeared in the doorway. "Nurse, thank God!" cried Mary, and began to weep. "You go and make us all a cup of tea," said Nurse Thomas with gruff kindness. And Mary fled. We'll continue this adventure of birth on a Christmas day next time.